In 1986, expectations for video game companies were rather low. It was 3 years after the 1983 Atari game crash. The NES would be released that year in September of 1986, and while today we recognize it as a huge influence on all of gaming, at the time the NES was fighting against the perception that video games were a fad. In any business, there comes a time when you've established your brand and your product, and now you simply deliver that product. Innovation is not necessarily something you're worried about, instead of simply delivering on expectations again and again. And so if you were going to start a new video game company in 1986 with the understanding that eventually you would reach that level where your brand has been established, where your product needs never innovate again, where you are a legend of the industry, you might instead choose to start a completely different company. And in many ways, that's exactly what Naotoshi Zin decided to do. In 1986, he founded Furumu Software, or anglicized as From Software Incorporated, and began producing productivity software. As a random anecdote, it is said that the reason the company is known as From Software is because Naotoshi felt that all of his inspiration comes from software. Regardless of its authenticity, it is a believably mundane origin story for what was a mundane company for many years. In fact, it wasn't until 1994 and the release of Sony's PlayStation that FromSoft would even release a game. Today, it's not remembered as a launch title for the PlayStation, but considering that it came out just 13 days after launch, I think it's fair to call it one. Kingsfield was released on December 16th, 1994 to resounding mediocrity. The game was unconventional, ugly, too hard, too slow, and simply frustrating. But it did allow FromSoft to shift into producing video games, and it would produce a lot of them over the coming years. We're going to skip ahead in time a bit, just a little while, 15 years to 2009. FromSoft has produced 50 games as of now on 10 different platforms and has created a name for itself with the Armored Core series, one of the longest running franchises in gaming at the time. This year, in February of 2009, they will return to their roots with an RPG. An ugly, slow, too hard, and simply frustrating RPG called Demon's Souls. And while we won't spend too long looking at it, everything we're about to say stems from here. It's an important stepping stone in the story, and while it's one we often forget, sometimes barely even acknowledge, it is a step on the path to our main attraction. Yes, 2009 is a brief stop on our trip and will continue forward in time a little bit longer, but we shouldn't skip it entirely. Forward another 2 years to September of 2001, the release of Dark Souls. Dark Souls had a ready-made population thanks to our last mentioned Demon's Souls, and a large part of that success is thanks to its slow uptake. Demon's Souls was not an incredible success overnight, it was a slow burn. Atlus, the publisher of Demon's Souls, expected sales in the 15,000 unit range, and yet every year the sales numbers would double, and by the time Dark Souls was released, Demons had sold through 1 million units, 500,000 in the year before Dark Souls was released. It was the perfect storm for Dark Souls to become the mega hit that it would go on to be. Dark Souls itself is not necessarily an incredible game. I don't mean to say that it is a bad game, though personally I'm not a fan. I don't enjoy them very much. I still don't mean that the game itself is somehow terrible. The game is just a game. It's not particularly groundbreaking in and of itself. It's neither the most graphically impressive, nor the most technologically extraordinary, nor the most dramatically exciting, mechanically notable, nor even a monumental seller. It doesn't have the cachet of being a launch title or a platform mover. It's not the highest rated, nor doesn't have the most awards, though it does have some very impressive awards. The fact is that Dark Souls is a game and a series that is controversially non-appealing. It is a title that no one loves at first. No one steps into and says this is the best game of all time immediately upon startup. In fact, Many will play the game for slightly longer than an hour and never play again, even though the game is well over 40 hours, into the 100+ hour range for thorough players. Yet the average player sees less than 10% of this game. And that's a ratio that continues throughout the series, even today. And yet those who manage to break through that barrier end up becoming enamored with the entire genre. Because yes, this game created an entire genre. Similar to Doom clones and the FPS genre Doom spawned, or Rogue and the genre of roguelikes that it spawned, Dark Souls is responsible for the Souls genres. And a quick lesson in terminology here, there are two genres, and while they are similar, they are not the same. Souls-like and Souls-light. This also applies to roguelike and roguelite, by the way, with similar distinctions. Like means it has all the ingredients required, a clone, as it were. A Souls-like is very, very similar to Dark Souls. It has enemies that drop souls, checkpoints, steep difficulties, and major bosses, carefully paced, skill-based melee combat, asynchronous multiplayer, punishing death penalties, gothic themes, a sense of darkness and dread, perhaps some spiritual existentialism tossed in with gallows humor, and a self-guided storyline. A like has all of these, or at the very least most of them, and in a very similar ape to Dark Souls. A light will take those and change them. Perhaps you don't have checkpoints, or maybe it's exclusively bosses and has no fodder enemies. Maybe there are no death penalties, or maybe it's a ranged combat instead of a melee. The point is that this is a confusing set of terms that ultimately tells you nothing about the game you're about to pick up. It's a pretty useless term, but unfortunately we have to continue using it until someone creates a better term like adventure core or streamer killer. For a game that has no real superior metrics and for which few players ever truly even begin to experience, let alone finish, and for which there is a swirling, failed ability to even explain what exactly its self-titled genre is. For all of this, what then is the reason for the success of the Souls games? Why is it beloved? Why is there a genre? Muddied though it may be, why does that genre even exist? How could this mediocre game beget by another mediocre game in a series of mediocre games? How could this be one of the most influential series in gaming history, perhaps the most influential series? Dark Souls repopularized the idea of games being difficult. It's often that Dark Souls is compared to Zelda. In fact, it's a common refrain that Dark Souls is what Zelda would be had it been allowed to grow up. However, I would argue that Dark Souls is what Zelda can never be, could never be. Zelda's director, Eiji Aonuma, and I call him that because he's directed or produced 22 Zelda-related games since 1998, has been recorded as saying that when a gamer is lost, the game has failed. The game should always handhold and lead the player to a solution. Dark Souls throws all of that away and allows the game to feel difficult. This might be the most controversial statement I have ever made on this channel, but Souls games are not particularly difficult. They're not mechanically hard. You don't have to have the best reactions or be the smartest or the most dedicated. Anyone can complete a Souls game in enough time, almost regardless of player skill. Instead, Souls approximates true difficulty. It's the difficulty of playing any game as a kid. Today, this series is held in high regard more because of its inherent fairness than its inherent difficulty. At release, it was this fairness that was disguised as difficulty. Go back and play a game you played as a kid, something that was difficult, hard to complete, and that you remember today. For me, as a kid, the hardest game I can imagine was The Lion King. Specifically that part where you jump on giraffe heads during the I just can't wait to be king level. It was so difficult to beat, impossible even. Today, I loaded up The Lion King. I was able to get past the giraffes using a keyboard my first try. If I used a controller, I could probably breeze through most of the game without any real trouble, and yet this section is stuck in my head as impossibly difficult. Dark Souls and Souls in general bring that feeling back. and that is what people took note of. Souls inspiration is obvious in games like Neo or Hollow Knight, and even more obvious in games like Lords of the Fallen or The Surge, but you don't need to be a Souls-like to be inspired by Souls. Plenty of games now try to tap into that old thrill, the need to be skilled enough to progress, without feeling like it's forced. Horizon Zero Dawn shows up a lot in these videos. Not specifically Souls videos, but videos about influence. One day, I think we'll all admit that Horizon is one of the most influential games of all time too, and it is clearly inspired by Souls. You can skirt through the first few hours of that game without ever learning a mechanic beyond shooting basic arrows. However, upon reaching the first cauldron, you will meet a boss that is a very common early enemy. And this boss will beat the crap out of you. And luckily, there's a save point immediately before the boss. This means you will need to beat the boss before you can continue, or you'll just never progress. And the only way to do that is to use different arrow types and traps, targeting weak points and breaking parts off the enemy. These are very basic concepts to Horizon, and yet you can arrive at this boss without ever having learned it, and certainly without having mastered it or being comfortable with the mechanics. However, once you've learned them and start using them, the game changes and becomes more enjoyable. This is similar in some ways to how The Lion King is to a child, or those racing levels from the first Sly game. You may feel like you're beating your head against a wall until something clicks, except that in Horizon, that experience is more deliberate in its method to create that fun and engaging experience. That deliberateness. Deliberacy? That purposefulness, I believe, was a byproduct of a chain reaction that Dark Souls set in motion. An idea now so ingrained in game design it almost seems stupid to attribute it to one series, and yet if we go back a decade to 2009, before Demon's Souls and Dark Souls after it, yes, while we will see games with a purposeful design, you won't see it as a means to an end, at least not this widely, until Souls hits the scene. This, of course, is not the only thing that Souls has given us, but it's probably the one thing that's rippled the furthest through all walks of games, rather than just games explicitly wanting to do what Dark Souls did, to be Souls-like. In Dark Souls, it is this purposeful sense of challenge, this sense of difficulty that describes the oppressiveness of the world you're in. And if we went back to that list of Souls-like and Souls-light, I would put world building as the #1 priority, even above gameplay. The difficulty shows the world in a certain light, and the tough but fair mentality recaptures that fleeting, almost nostalgic feeling of breaking through challenge by learning the game. This is what has permeated the entire industry, and this is why Horizons is as much a Souls-inspired title as any other, not just the large enemies you have to fight. The sense of purposefulness additionally does not require that you follow any of the other requirements for Souls-likeness. Bloodborne drops most of the RPG mechanics from Souls. It goes from hundreds or dozens of similar weapons to a smaller subset that all feel unique, and it focuses more on faster gameplay, more aggression. Yet it too focuses most on world building and a purposeful use of difficulty to describe the universe. The difficulty epitomizes the cruel truth of Bloodborne and its world. You can only experience something for the first time once. It is a masterclass in pacing and using gameplay to further that pacing, dedicating entire segments to new original enemies, making you think that the story is heading in one direction, only to throw them all away in order to hit you with another story beat entirely, leading you in the true story direction. It's absolutely genius. Or Sekiro, which almost stubbornly refuses to adhere to the Souls-like genre rule set at all, itself barely even a Souls-light. Sekiro takes out nearly every RPG element and takes the weapon count down to 1. and an even faster pace than Bloodborne, while still bringing back the importance of defending from the Souls games. It has an upgrade system where the upgrades are earned far more like Zelda than any Souls game before it, and the Souls system is completely gone. And this was one of the most defining features of the entire genre, literally right up there at the top. It further breaks series convention by having a main character with writing and voice acting instead of a customized player character. And while I can't argue about whether or not that's a good thing, it still speaks to how FromSoft sought to break their own mold while still maintaining familiarity. When Elden Ring is released, I'm sure it too will further break the expectations of what Souls means. And additionally, you know George R.R. Martin is going to make some gangly bosses and it's going to be neato. Yet through all of these, the true Souls-likeness is its purposefulness, its dedication to difficulty, not simply to be hard, but instead to make you better. In essence, the soul of Souls is actually get good, and that's not where I expected to land when I started writing this video. However, it's the most boiled down way of saying it, and I suddenly have a new respect for the depth of the meme. This is the legacy of Souls. This is the lack of innovation. The brand and product that need never be changed, only re-delivered to expectation again and again. Difficulty as medium, encapsulating nostalgia for games that were never really hard, but required some level of personal skill growth to complete. This difficulty as methodology, wherein the hard game is simply a requirement to allow you to feel that you succeeded on a level that a game which holds your hand and never allows you to get lost, never allows you to fail or get frustrated and quit. A game that allows all of this also allows you to grow, to get better, to improve yourself. And this is a feeling very few games are able to achieve. This is the definition of a Souls game, and it should be the defining characteristic of a Souls-like. This script leans heavily on RACROX, who by all accounts should have put this video on his own channel for the amount he contributed. He's done a fantastic video on the rocky development of Spyro Reignited, and the amount of work he did was truly incredible. I've linked it in the description, and if you'd like to hear about how that game almost didn't exist, the level of self-sacrifice from the developers, and the brutality of Activision, I highly recommend checking it out. We'd absolutely appreciate it if you would share this video, but if you'd prefer to watch another, and you'd be interested in learning about the history of Gearbox, the scandals and intellectual property theft, and the various ways that Gearbox has screwed over hundreds of developers and potentially funneled millions of dollars from major publishers to fund their own passion projects, you can watch that video in the corner right now. Thank you to everyone who subscribes, likes, and shares our videos on Reddit, and we'll see you on the next one.